Well, this one isn't so much as a news topic. It's more something that supporters of the DF supporter program asked me to look into. And out of morbid curiosity more than anything else, I wanted to check it out. So back in the day, we did a piece of content where we compared. This was when the M2 upgrades for PlayStation 5 were enabled, and you could add in your own drives to the PlayStation 5. And I did a piece of content which basically compared the absolute worst drive on the market to the best drive on the market, and found that, well, the worst drive had some issues with write speeds and whatnot, but it basically played games just fine. And at the time, Ratchet and Clank was the go-to game for stressing out SSD during gameplay. But obviously these days it's Marvel's Spider-Man 2, which, you know, takes what Ratchet did and pushed it still further. And I decided to test it on the worst PCIe Gen 4 SSD available, which is, and let me check my notes here, it is the Western Digital SN750 SE, specifically the 250 gigabyte version. It is by far the slowest and least capable SSD available. And the requirement for a drive on PlayStation 5 is that you have basically 5.5 gigabytes per second of sequential read bandwidth. This only has 3.2 gigabytes per second, 58% of the required transfer rate. But we can actually make this drive even worse by basically taping up. Honestly, this sounds ridiculous, but it works. You could just tape up the pins on the drive and give it basically PCI Express 1x bandwidth rather than 4x bandwidth. When you format the drive, it does work, and you get a warning from the PlayStation 5 basically saying that, I think it's like you get something like 1.7 gigabytes per second of bandwidth, or 1.8, something like that. But it basically warns you that it's not fit for purpose. But Marvel Spider-Man plays fine. Marvel Spider-Man 2, rather. You know, I've got here some comparisons of loading the game, a new game. Yes, it's slower. You can obviously see the difference there. It's a slower drive. And I guess a load from scratch is going to be sequential, heavy on sequential reads, which this thing just doesn't really have anymore. But surprisingly, all the traversal stuff just works, even on this really slow drive. And John, I think there's a bit of a discussion here to say, when we're talking about the power of the SSD, which is kind of like the meme, isn't it? There's actually much more to the SSD and the whole I/O subsystem than simply how fast it can load in X amount of gigabytes per second.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what they mean when they talk about it as well. It's like there's the decompression block, obviously, which is a huge deal. CPU side of things as well, obviously the drive itself. But then another really important thing that Mike brought up in that interview we did on Spider-Man is that the game engine itself needs to be efficient in terms of how it handles its data and accepts all that data in, right? Like, just because you can fetch a lot of data quickly doesn't mean that you can just automatically take advantage of that, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's this entire I/O stack that is important here, and just the speed of the drive by itself. As long as it hits like a minimum threshold, I think it should be okay. That actually made me wonder, though, if it's possible if somebody's made an M2 like adapter that allows you to essentially plug into a mechanical drive.
Not yet. I did look into it.
I mean, there's no point in doing that, so why would you waste your time? It's literally just to mess around here, right? But it's still, that idea is funny.
Yeah.
But yes, the decompression block and everything, I think, is probably the most important aspect of this entire pipeline, rather than the drive speed itself, right?
I think there's also just the nature of what an SSD is, which is that, there's no head searching for data. There's no seek time. It's basically instant. So,
that's right.
It all depends not really on your sequential read bandwidth, but also on, bursts of data, much smaller packets of data, that sort of thing. But, I'm curious what you think about this, Oliver.
Well, I mean, if you think about it in kind of an abstract sense, right? Because obviously people are very invested in the console war and like which SSD is faster or something. But like abstractly speaking, I mean, the PS5's internal SSD and supported M.2 SSDs and also on the Xbox, they're just so much faster. Obviously, in terms of the random stuff, but in terms of sequential, just unbelievably fast relative to storage mediums that we've used in the past, like consumer grade hard drives. I mean, all you're doing, like John said, is lifting one of the constraints on game loading, and there could be many, many more constraints, right? But I don't think that's a bad thing, because most games are quite linear, and obviously you need to be pushing some really, really intense game concepts like Insomniac has been doing to even stress these machines out to show you something that's fundamentally a different experience than you could have experienced on a last-gen machine. My only note in these tests is that I've not quite beaten Spider-Man 2 yet. I'm about 2/3 the way through. There is one portal sequence closer to the beginning of the game that seems quite stressful. But for the most part, for my money, just based on what it looks like visually, I'd have to imagine that the portal sequence in like the first 40 minutes of Ratchet and Clank would probably be the most stressful sequence, just because you're loading.
That's what I.
Yeah. You're loading
it
through all
works
these
fine
areas.
there too.
Right.
I tested that back in the day. It worked fine.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess also it means that, that maybe at some point in the future there will be some kind of application that requires, not just the decompression blocks and instant access to any part of the data on the drive, but there might be an application that requires this massive amount of bandwidth. And maybe at some point we will actually see, some sort of big change there. I mean, I guess I was going into this one with the hope that we would see some sort of collapse of the game systems. But it kind of goes back to what you were saying, John, when you spoke to Mike Fitzgerald from Insomniac, where he was saying that, well, actually, it's not just the SSD. We've actually re-architected our system so the amount of data that's being put through the system is lower anyway.
That's
so
right.
they're optimizing on multiple fronts there. But yeah, this was just a really interesting sort of test that I wanted to carry out. But, please don't. Well, if you want to sort of go out and buy this really bad drive just to experiment with it, fair enough. I mean, it only cost me like £50. But, it's to the point now where really good drives cost, a super dirt cheap. So just buy one of those instead. Buy a on-spec drive.
I'm actually curious, Rich, if you did test with the taped off drive there, like what it does to like installation time or like IO stuff.
Copying, I had to copy Marvel Spider-Man from the internal to the M2, and it took a bit longer, but it still wasn't that bad.
Because that's been the main issue with like cheaper SSDs is their sustained reads and writes, especially writes. Like if we're doing like video capture, right? Like really high end, large video capture, a lot of these cheap ones, you eventually just hit the wall and it just can't keep up with the amount of writing happening on the drive, and you start to get dropped frames and other problems, right?
Yeah. Didn't you have an issue with Gran Turismo 7 or another PS5
okay,
game?
so I actually want to mention this. This is a different issue altogether, and this is something that has kind of cropped up off and on from people. And essentially, when PlayStation 5 games are installed to an add-in M2 drive, sometimes they break, and I don't know why yet. In my case, it was Gran Turismo 7, where essentially you could see the races would still load at first, but it would take significantly longer to load a race, and then eventually it would just crash. And when it crashed, it really crashed. Like the whole system went down, and it wouldn't come back on for like a solid minute, and then it would come back on, have to do all this repair, and it was acting super weird. I started seeing other people encounter this with other games, and every time it was like, try moving it off that add-in drive and putting it onto the internal, and it always fixes it. So I don't think it's necessarily the internal drive speed that's an issue, but there's something that seems to be able to occur that's breaking games occasionally on this add-in drive, and I don't understand what's going on there yet. So that is something. Just a PSA: if you're playing a game on your PS5 and it's installed on that extra drive and it starts to act weird or crash or just do strange things, just try moving it over to the internal.